5 years after his first New York show, Thomas walked through the halls of Morton Gallery. But this time, he wasn't pushing him up. He was there to see his own exhibition, a permanent collection of his work, displayed in the very building where he'd spent decades cleaning floors. The centerpiece of the exhibition was his newest painting, specially commissioned by the gallery. It showed the building at night, from a cleaner's perspective, just like the one he'd made years ago in his basement studio. But this version was different. It showed not just the art on the walls, but the people who kept the gallery running, the security guards, the maintenance staff, the late-night cleaners. Each figure glowed with dignity and purpose. Thomas had used his success to create something meaningful. He started a foundation called Hidden Artists, which provided art supplies, studio space, and mentoring to working-class artists. The basement where he used to paint in secret was now a fully equipped studio, free for maintenance workers who wanted to create art after their shifts. He'd never forgotten his roots. Even now, with his paintings selling for millions, he kept his old work uniform hanging in his studio. To remind me where I came from, he'd tell young artists who visited him, "Never be ashamed of who you are or what you do to make a living. Your job is what you do, not who you are." The foundation did more than just provide supplies. It organized exhibitions in community centers, laundromats, and other unexpected places. Art started appearing everywhere: beautiful murals in subway stations, sculptures in public parks, paintings in school cafeterias. Thomas believed that art belonged everywhere, not just in fancy galleries. The story of the janitor-turned-millionaire artist made headlines worldwide, but Thomas stayed humble. He still lived in his old neighborhood, though now he owned the building and kept the rents affordable for working families. He turned the ground floor into an art school where local kids could take free classes. Mrs. Lee became the director of the foundation, helping other overlooked artists find their voice. Together, they created scholarships for maintenance workers and their children who wanted to study art. "Talent can come from anywhere," she'd say at foundation events. "We just need to open our eyes and really look." The art world had changed too. Galleries started paying attention to unconventional artists, looking for talent in places they'd never considered before. Other institutions followed Morton Gallery's lead, creating programs to support artists from working-class backgrounds. Thomas's original basement studio remained exactly as it was, preserved behind glass as part of the gallery's permanent exhibition. Visitors could see the old boilers, the wobbly table, the single light bulb, all kept exactly as they were when he painted there. It reminded everyone that great art could come from the most unlikely places. On special nights, Thomas would still come to the gallery after hours. He'd walk the quiet halls, remembering his years of mopping these same floors. Sometimes he'd stop and talk to the cleaning staff, sharing stories and encouraging their dreams. "Keep looking at the art," he'd tell them. "Keep learning. Keep creating. Your time will come." His story became a symbol of hope, proving that talent and determination could overcome any obstacle. But more than that, it changed how people saw the invisible workers who kept their world running. Now, when visitors came to Morton Gallery, they didn't just look at the art on the walls. They noticed the people cleaning the floors and wondered what masterpieces might be hiding in their hearts. The morning the art dealer from New York walked into Morton Gallery changed everything. He wasn't there to see the main exhibition. He'd heard whispers about a janitor's paintings at a community center and had to see them for himself. Mr. Thompson was different from other dealers. He didn't care about fancy degrees or prestigious art schools. He cared about raw talent, about art that made people feel something real. When he walked into the community center and saw Thomas' paintings, he stood completely still for almost an hour, moving from piece to piece in absolute silence. Finally, he asked to meet the artist. When Thomas arrived, still in his work uniform after his night shift, Mr. Thompson didn't even blink. He looked Thomas straight in the eye and said, "Your work is extraordinary. You see things others miss, and you make us see them too. I want to represent you." Thomas barely understood what that meant at first, but Mr. Thompson explained everything about galleries in New York, about collectors who would pay serious money for authentic art, about museums that were always looking for fresh perspectives. "Your paintings tell stories that need to be heard," he said. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Mr. Thompson arranged for Thomas's paintings to be professionally photographed. He sent the images to gallery owners and collectors across the country. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Everyone wanted to know more about the janitor-turned-artist who painted life from the ground up. A prestigious gallery in New York offered to host a solo exhibition. They wanted 20 new paintings from Thomas. For the first time in his life, he took a leave of absence from his cleaning job. He spent days in his basement studio, painting like a man possessed. But now he had proper canvases, professional paints, and all the supplies he could need, all provided by his new gallery. The exhibition opening in New York was nothing like the community center show. Bright lights, champagne, people in expensive clothes, and at the center of it all, Thomas's paintings. He still wore his work uniform, but now it was a statement. He wasn't hiding who he was proud of his journey. The same art critics who would have ignored him months ago now fought to interview him. They called his work revolutionary and a breath of fresh air in the contemporary art scene. One critic wrote, "His paintings remind us that beauty exists everywhere, if only we have the eyes to see it." The prices for his paintings shot up faster than anyone expected. The first one sold for $50,000. By the end of the night, paintings were going for hundreds of thousands of dollars. One collector bought an entire series for $2 million. Thomas could hardly believe the numbers he was hearing. Back at Morton Gallery, the news spread like wildfire. The same people who had mocked him now scrambled to say they'd always seen his potential. The curator who'd made fun of his amateur attempts now claimed he'd been discovering new talent. But Thomas didn't hold grudges. He was too busy living his dream. Mrs. Lee watched it all with quiet pride. She believed in him when no one else would, had seen the artist behind the mop. Now the whole world was seeing it too. Thomas kept telling everyone about how she helped him, insisting that she come to New York for the opening. Without her, he'd say, I'd still be hiding my art in the basement. The community center on 43rd Street wasn't much to look at. Its walls needed fresh paint, and the fluorescent lights buzzed like angry bees. But Mrs. Lee had chosen it for a reason. This was where real people gathered, not just the wealthy art crowd who frequented Morton Gallery. She'd arranged everything herself, hanging Thomas's paintings with the same care she used for million-dollar masterpieces. Each piece was positioned perfectly, letting the harsh fluorescent lights somehow make the colors seem even more alive. The show was simply titled Hidden. Thomas stood in the corner during the opening, still wearing his work uniform. He'd come straight from his shift, too nervous to go home and change. His hands kept fidgeting with his cap, turning it over and over. The community center's main room was filling up with people, not the usual gallery crowd in expensive suits, but ordinary folks from the neighborhood. A group of kids from the nearby high school pressed their faces close to his painting of the corner store couple. "Look," one exclaimed, "that's Mr. and Mrs. Wilson. I buy candy from them every day." Another kid pointed at a different painting. "And that's the sunrise over the lake. Man, it looks exactly like that." Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. People started coming in just to see the janitor's paintings. But they weren't coming to mock. They were coming because they saw their own lives reflected in his art. His paintings told their stories, showed their world through eyes that understood its beauty. Then something unexpected happened. A small article appeared in a local arts blog, talking about the remarkable exhibition in an unexpected venue. The writer praised the raw honesty of the work, the unique perspective, the masterful use of light and shadow. Other critics started showing up, drawn by the buzz. "These aren't just paintings," one critic wrote, "they're windows into a world most of us walk past every day without seeing. The artist forces us to stop, to really look, to recognize the extraordinary in the ordinary." The tiny community center started getting calls from art lovers across the city. People who'd never set foot in this neighborhood were suddenly making the trip, eager to see these paintings everyone was talking about. They'd arrive in their expensive cars, looking slightly nervous, but leave with their perspectives changed. Mrs. Lee watched it all with quiet satisfaction. She'd seen something special in Thomas's work, and now others were seeing it too. But what made her happiest was watching Thomas himself. He still stood in the corner, still wore his work uniform, but he stood a little straighter now. When people asked him about his paintings, his voice grew stronger with each explanation. A local news station did a small feature about the exhibition. They interviewed people from the neighborhood who'd seen their lives and their world captured in Thomas's paintings. "He sees us," one elderly woman said, tears in her eyes. "He really sees us." The most powerful moment came when a group of maintenance workers from other buildings in the city visited the exhibition. They came in their work uniforms, some still holding their mops or brooms. They stood before Thomas's paintings in silence, seeing their own lives elevated to art, their daily work transformed into something beautiful. By the end of the first week, every painting had a red dot next to it, the Universal Gallery symbol for sold. But more importantly, something had shifted in the way people saw Thomas and the way he saw himself. He wasn't just the guy who cleaned floors anymore. He was an artist who happened to be a janitor, and his time of being invisible was coming to an end. The whispers followed Thomas everywhere now. As he pushed his mop down the gallery halls, he could feel the stares and hear the muffled laughs. The other maintenance staff kept their distance, as if his dream of being an artist was somehow contagious. But Thomas just kept his head down and continued working, the same way he had for over 2 decades. During his lunch breaks, instead of eating alone in the basement like usual, he'd now sit with Mrs. Lee in her small office. She'd brought in art books from her personal collection, thick volumes about color theory and composition. Thomas would carefully turn the pages with his work-worn hands, soaking up knowledge like a sponge in water. "Look at how Van Gogh uses yellow here," she'd say, pointing to a painting of sunflowers. "You do something similar in your night scenes, the way you make the streetlights glow." Thomas would nod, seeing his own instincts reflected in the work of the masters. But not everyone was supportive like Mrs. Lee. One morning, Thomas arrived at his basement studio to find someone had been there. His easel was knocked over, and some of his paints had been squeezed out onto the floor. A note was left that read, "Know your place." Thomas stood there for a long time, looking at the mess. 20 years ago, this might have broken his spirit. But now, he simply picked up the easel, cleaned up the paint, and got to work. He had something to say through his art, and no amount of cruelty could silence that voice anymore. The janitor's determination seemed to frustrate his critics even more. He'd overhear conversations in the halls. "Did you see what the cleaning man painted now? He thinks he's the next Picasso." Or, "Someone needs to tell him to stick to what he knows: toilets and trash cans." Despite the mockery, Thomas painted with even greater passion. His basement studio became his sanctuary. The hum of the boilers drowned out the whispers from above, and in that warm, dim space, he could be truly free. He started experimenting more, trying new techniques he learned from Mrs. Lee's books. He painted a series of portraits: the security guard who always shared his coffee, the homeless man who slept on the gallery steps, the young art students who actually smiled at him instead of looking through him. Each painting captured not just their faces, but their dignity, their humanity. Mrs. Lee watched his progress with growing excitement. "You're getting better every day," she'd tell him. "Your understanding of light and shadow, the way you capture emotions, it's remarkable." But Thomas would just shake his head modestly and say, "I'm just telling the stories I see, ma'am." One day, while cleaning the main gallery, Thomas overheard 2 wealthy collectors discussing a new painting on display. $50,000, one said, "and honestly, I don't even understand it." Thomas looked at the abstract canvas they were talking about, then down at his hands that still had paint under the nails from his night's work. He didn't paint for money or fame. He painted because he had to, because the art lived inside him and needed to come out. The mockery and sabotage continued, but something strange started happening. The more they tried to discourage him, the stronger his resolve became. Each snide comment, each sideways glance, each whispered joke, that all became fuel for his art. He painted with the strength of someone who had spent a lifetime being underestimated and was finally ready to show the world who he really was. The morning everything changed started like any other. Thomas was finishing up his night shift, wiping down the last few display cases before the gallery opened. The sun hadn't risen yet, and the empty halls were quiet except for the soft squeak of his cleaning cloth against glass. He'd stayed later than usual that morning, trying to get rid of some particularly stubborn fingerprints on the cases. That's when he heard the click of heels on the marble floor. Looking up, he saw Mrs. Lee, the new assistant curator, walking through the gallery. She was young, probably in her early 30s, and had only been working at Morton for a few months. Thomas quickly gathered his cleaning supplies, hoping to slip away unnoticed as usual. But in his hurry, he knocked over his bucket. Water splashed across the floor, and his folder of sketches fell out of his jacket pocket, scattering across the wet marble. Mrs. Lee rushed over to help, picking up the papers before they could get too wet. That's when she saw what was on them. She stopped mid-motion, holding one of Thomas's sketches up to the light. It was his drawing of the elderly couple from the corner store, the one he'd been working on during his breaks. "Did you draw this?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine surprise. Thomas felt his heart racing. For 23 years, he'd managed to keep his art private, sharing it with no one. Now here was someone from the art world, the real art world, looking at his work. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly, reaching for the sketch, "just something I do to pass the time." But Mrs. Lee didn't hand it back. Instead, she kept looking through the other sketches, her eyes growing wider with each one. "These are extraordinary," she said. "The way you capture light and shadow. Have you had any training?" Thomas shook his head. "No, ma'am. Just what I've learned from watching the paintings here." Mrs. Lee looked at him with new eyes, no longer seeing just another maintenance worker. "Would you show me more?" she asked. That's how Thomas found himself leading the assistant curator down to his hidden basement studio. His hands trembled as he pulled out his paintings from behind the filing cabinet. He'd never shown them to anyone before, and now here he was, displaying them to someone who looked at masterpieces for a living. Mrs. Lee spent almost an hour looking through his work. She asked questions about his techniques, his inspiration, how long he'd been painting. Thomas answered honestly, telling her about his years of quiet observation, about mixing discarded paints, about working by the light of a single bulb. The next day, word spread through the gallery about the janitor who painted. Most of the other curators and staff brushed it off as a joke. "A janitor who thinks he's an artist?" They laughed. What's next? The security guard writing symphonies. Some were even cruel about it. Thomas overheard one curator telling another, "Just because someone can hold a brush doesn't make them an artist. This isn't some fairy tale where the cleaning man turns out to be a hidden genius." But Mrs. Lee saw something different. She saw raw talent that had been quietly growing in the shadows for decades. She saw paintings that told stories most artists would never think to tell, from angles they'd never think to use. And most importantly, she saw an artist who painted not for fame or money, but because his soul needed to create. That morning marked the beginning of a change, not just for Thomas, but for the entire art world. Though he didn't know it yet, his life was about to transform in ways he'd never imagined, all because of a spilled bucket of water and a young curator who took the time to really look. Behind the massive boilers in the gallery's basement, Thomas had created his own little world. The space wasn't much, just a narrow corner with a wobbly table he'd rescued from the gallery's storage room, and a wooden stool with one leg slightly shorter than the others. But to Thomas, this spot was more precious than all the fancy studios upstairs combined. He'd hung a single light bulb from an exposed pipe, and its warm glow cast dancing shadows on the concrete walls. The constant hum of the boilers became his background music, a steady rhythm that kept him company during those long nights of painting. The heat they gave off wasn't just warmth, it helped his paint dry faster and kept his fingers nimble during winter. Over time, Thomas had gotten creative with his art supplies. He learned that the restoration department regularly threw out small tubes of paint with just a little bit left inside. Each night, he'd carefully squeeze out every last drop, mixing colors like a chef combining rare spices. The janitor's closet became his treasure chest, old rags turned into texture tools, and spare cardboard became pallets. One night, while taking out the trash, he found a half-broken easel. The rich art students who took classes upstairs had tossed it out because one leg was cracked. Thomas spent 3 nights fixing it with wood glue and strips of metal he'd collected. It wasn't pretty, but it stood straight and proud in his hidden studio. His paintings started small, just quick studies on scraps of paper. But as his confidence grew, so did his ambitions. He began working on larger pieces, using discarded canvases that still had blank spaces on the back. Some nights, he'd work until his arms ached and his eyes burned from straining in the dim light, but he never complained. Each stroke of the brush felt like freedom. The subjects of his paintings came from his heart. He painted the elderly couple who ran the corner store near his apartment, capturing the laugh lines around their eyes and the way they still held hands after 50 years together. He painted the sunrise over Lake Michigan, with colors so vivid you could almost feel the morning breeze. But his favorite pieces were the ones that showed life in the gallery itself, the quiet moments no one else noticed. There was one painting he worked on longer than the others. It showed the gallery at night, from a cleaner's perspective. In it, you could see the grand paintings on the walls, but they were reflected in the newly mopped floor, creating a mirror world where art and reality mixed together. The painting told a story about beauty being found in unexpected places. Sometimes, Thomas would hear footsteps above while he painted, and he'd quickly cover his work. The maintenance supervisor had no idea about his makeshift studio, and Thomas wanted to keep it that way. He'd learned long ago that some people didn't like it when you tried to be more than what they thought you should be. After each painting session, he'd carefully clean everything up, making sure not to leave any trace of his art. The paintings themselves were stored behind an old filing cabinet, wrapped in clean trash bags to protect them from dust. To anyone else, it looked like just another dark corner of the basement. But Thomas knew better. He knew that dreams could grow even in the darkest places. Every morning, as he walked home in the early dawn light, his fingernails would still have specks of paint under them. He'd look at his hands, rough from work, stained with colors, and smile. These were the hands of a janitor, yes, but they were also the hands of an artist. And one day, he promised himself the world would see both. The halls of Morton Art Gallery stood silent as the evening light faded through its grand windows. While the wealthy art collectors and critics had long gone home, one man remained, quietly pushing his mop across the polished marble floors. His name was Thomas Jackson, and for 23 years, he'd been the night janitor at one of Chicago's most prestigious art galleries. Every night, after finishing his regular cleaning duties, Thomas would take a few extra minutes to stand before the masterpieces hanging on the walls. He'd study them with the kind of attention most people reserve for reading love letters. His eyes would trace every brushstroke, trying to understand how the artists created such magic on canvas. The security guards got used to seeing him like this, a tall, thin man in his blue work uniform, standing perfectly still before million-dollar paintings. Some thought he was just taking a break from work, but Thomas was doing something else entirely. He was learning. In his coat pocket, he always carried a small notebook, its pages crumpled from constant use. When nobody was looking, he'd quickly sketch what he saw, using a stubby pencil he'd found in the gallery's lost and found box. His rough hands, calloused from years of manual labor, would move across the paper with surprising grace. The other cleaning staff would sometimes catch him drawing and shake their heads. "Man, you're wasting your time," they'd say, but Thomas would just smile and keep sketching. He had a dream that was bigger than their doubt. At home, in his tiny apartment on the South Side, Thomas had turned his kitchen into a makeshift art studio. He couldn't afford proper canvases, so he painted on pieces of cardboard he collected from behind the grocery store. His paints came from the dollar store, and his brushes were worn down to nubs, but none of that mattered to him. One evening, while cleaning near the restoration room, he noticed some paint samples and old canvases in the trash. The restoration team had thrown them out after finishing their work on a famous painting. Thomas looked around, making sure no one was watching, and carefully picked them up. To others, it was garbage, but to him, it was treasure. He started bringing these discarded materials to a small corner he'd cleaned up in the gallery's basement, behind the old boilers. The space was cramped and poorly lit, but the warmth from the boilers kept his paints from freezing during Chicago's harsh winters. Here, in this hidden spot, Thomas would paint after his shift ended, sometimes until the sun began to rise. His paintings weren't like anything hanging in the gallery above. They told stories of everyday life: kids playing basketball in the street, old folks sitting on their porches, people waiting for buses in the rain. But there was something special about them, something that made you stop and look twice. His years of studying the masters had taught him how to capture not just what things looked like, but how they felt. The sound of his mop bucket scraping across the floor became a familiar melody in the gallery's quiet halls. During the day, art critics would discuss technique and composition in fancy words he didn't understand. But at night, Thomas spoke the same language as the masterpieces surrounding him, the language of color, light, and shadow. Some nights, when the moon cast long shadows through the skylights, Thomas would talk to the paintings like old friends. One day, he'd whisper, "One day, I'll have something to say too." Little did he know, that day would come sooner than he thought, and it would change not just his life, but the lives of countless others who dared to dream beyond their circumstances.